Morning. Welcome to this second day of the WAC conference. My name is Frédéric Clavert. I'm an assistant professor at the C2DH at the University of Luxembourg. I used to present myself as a historian playing with tweets, but I'm not playing with tweets anymore, and that's what we are going to talk about in a way. I'll allow myself to do a small introductory speech before my co-panelists will introduce themselves and start with a short statement. So, archiving social media in an age of APIcalypse. In 2016, the Cambridge Analytica scandal in relation to the the Brexit UK referendum and the US presidential elections changed obviously our relationship to social media. But our relationship to social media data changed too. Social media data could also be toxic data, which use could influence and mine democracies. The Cambridge Analytica scandal emphasized even more in this sense the importance of studying social media, but partly using this scandal as an excuse, major platforms such as Facebook closed down their API access, undermining those possibilities that we had to practice research on those platforms. The scandal was indeed only an excuse because Facebook started, in fact, to change its access policy for commercial purposes in 2015, and LinkedIn restricted its API access the same year. As a consequence, lots of research projects had to stop. I think the AlgoPol project, for instance, in France, stopped before its end because of that. Axel Bruns in 2019 used the expression of APIcalypse. I'm not sure that he created it, but his article is the reference article about that. And he used this expression this notion to describe this phenomenon of platforms closing down their APIs and analyze their consequences. He also clearly advocated the idea that these platforms were, and sometimes are still, fighting against any critical research about themselves. The phenomenon of APIcalypse is not a linear one. Twitter's policy has been a succession, for instance, of ups and downs, but remained relatively open until last year. In 2020, for instance, researchers who could use the free access to the regular API before were granted by Twitter a specific access that was very interesting for researchers, but I think a bit less for heritage institutions. But Elon Musk took over Twitter, renamed it X, made it the reference social media for the US alt-right, and decided to change the prices of its API products. Today, collecting tweets is not sustainable for heritage or research institutions, unless you've got $40,000 per month. We are living a second wave of APIcalypse since 2023, as Twitter, but also Reddit, closed down their free access to their APIs because of their economic model, that's sure, and because with the rise of the large language models and chatbots, social media data became an even more important commercial and financial asset for those firms. In parallel to those waves of APIcalypse, most archive institutions, including web archive services from many national libraries, have tried to archive social media. As many of you know better than I do, it is not an easy task. Among other social media archiving projects, the Be Social project at the Belgian Royal Library showed that very well. The Library of Congress Twitter archive is not accessible to research today, as far as I know. And if the Twitter archive from the INA is a very impressive one, it had to be constantly adapted to socio-technical changes. Jerome will speak about that, of the Twitter API. And tweet harvesting is for now on hold since mid-2023. Of course, almost all web archives services are archiving some parts of those social media as web pages. But this kind of archiving, which is very useful, does not fit all research questions and is, in the end, quite specific in terms of scope. So access to API is strategic for archiving and research. The recent European Digital Service Act, the DSA, might be a decisive step forwards, but might only. But a recent report showed that the platform's policies to conform to the DSA are quite diverse. And the efficiency of those APIs for researchers that are set up for the DSA are yet to be evaluated. In other words, the DSA is probably not putting an end to this APIcalypse because it's geographically limited, because the notion of systemic risk that is in the DSA remains ambiguous, and ambiguity is always a problem in legal terms. And this ambiguity allows those firms to restrict researchers' access to their data. Last but not least, the DSA has nothing to do with heritage or archiving. To discuss all those challenges today, we submitted this roundtable to the IIPC, and we thank the IIPC to have accepted it. Our speakers will be Anat Ben David, Associate Professor of Communication at the Open University of Israel, Beatrice Cannelli, PhD researchers in digital humanities at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London, Benjamin Ooghe-Tabanou, who is a research engineer specialized in web mining and social network analysis for social sciences at the Sciences Po Paris Media and Jerôme Thièvre, who is the manager of the web archive team at the Institut National de l'Audiovisual. We will start with introductory statements from each of our panelists. We will try to manage this roundtable so that we've got quite a lot of time for questions from the audience, from you, as the idea is to foster a debate and discussion on the subject. For those introductory statements, we will start with Beatrice.
Thank you. As Frédéric mentioned, I'm Beatrice Cannelli. I'm a PhD researcher at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. And over the past 3 years, I've been researching challenges and opportunities related to the development of social media archives at an institutional level. Through my research, I've tried to capture the first-hand experience and the perspective of web archivists dealing daily with the many challenges related to the preservation of social media. And I investigated curatorial and collection practices and, of course, the obstacles related to this process. Central, of course, to the preservation of social media is the essential task of collecting this information from the live platforms. And depending on the institution's mission and goal, each institution have adopted different methods of collections, have adopted different tools to harvest content from social media, including web crawlers and APIs, often mixing together available tools or developing their own in order to capture a representative snapshot of events and phenomena unfolding on social media. And in my research, I have explored how APIs have been used in practice in different archiving institutions, examining all the legal, curatorial, and technical challenges associated with this method of collection. And because of the ever-changing nature of social media platforms, and especially their terms of service, I have also looked into how the limitations imposed by social media companies on access, and specifically in this case, the use of APIs to access information generated on these sites shape the collections that are being developed today, and the way users are able to experience and study the material preserved.
Thank you, Beatrice. If no panelists has questions, then we will move to Benjamin, who has a presentation with some slides.
Yes. Hey, I'm not sure. Yes, it works. So yeah, I'm Benjamin Ooghe-Tabanou. I'm a research engineer at Medialab Sciences Po, which is a young lab created at Sciences Po to do social sciences on the digital and also use digital methods in general to study society. Most of the time, a little bit of both at the same time. We are quite a typical lab for research, as we have a lot of engineers and designers, and which helped forge a place where we try to build open source tools that can serve our research, but also any research over the world, and actually also a journalist or else, and which includes a lot of tools to actually collect data from the web, from social networks. And so, of course, we use and leverage a lot social media APIs, especially because when you want to study society and what happens on the web, the discussions that are between the users are really representative. I mean, not necessarily representative, but are really important to study different subjects and how people discuss it. I really like this cartoon from XKCD, which I think is very representative of the web and social networks. I gave a small logo of MyNet, which is this tool that we develop and which is an open source tool that anybody can download and that can help anyone in very few lines to collect data from all APIs. I mean, not all, but a lot of APIs that are still existent, but also provide scraping tools to collect more data on other platforms. Why did we use social media APIs? Mostly because it gives access to this data, but we could already do that with scraping, and we did actually. But the real difference with APIs is that you can scale. And because when you do scraping, you have to simulate collecting a page. I think web archivists know that quite well, as they have to collect and harvest all of these web pages individually, and it takes a lot of time, especially when there is one page for one single text of 140 characters. So when you want millions of those, APIs are a really efficient way to access it. So it was very useful for that. It was also very useful because it provides immediately structured data, which is a strong difference with just collecting pages, HTML pages. When you get data that is already formatted with different fields saying this is the user ID and this is the user picture and such, it's very, very practical and it goes way faster. But it also had some drawbacks. Those are real black boxes. You don't know exactly what's inside and how they answer what you request, and sometimes you try to get some results, but you don't understand why some results that you get are not those that you expect. And also there is always the question with social networks of the representativeness, because, for instance, Twitter is very popular among journalists, politics, but does it represent really what most people think? But I'm trying to go to the next slide.
Take like a few seconds.
Here it is. So I just wanted to show a brief example of why, and I mean, what can we do with such social media data? And here's an example of a study that required the use of 3 different APIs. So we use the Twitter Friends API, which allowed you to collect for specific users the list of followers or friends of those users. So we did that for about 5 million relationships between French users and MPs to try to do a map of political positioning of those users, which is what you can see on the map on the left, where you see most political French parties, which have been positioned depending on this network of relationship between the users. Then on the second step, we use the search and timeline APIs from Twitter, version 1. I guess we'll discuss this later. But to collect about 130 million tweets, which included 24 million links. And then by projecting the position of those, the domain names of the users who shared those tweets on the map of the political positioning, you can get a political positioning map of websites and medias, which is the map in the middle. I think it's too small. Yeah, unfortunately, but you could see most the position. I mean, you can find the medias and see where they're positioned. So, for instance, Mediapart you can find is close to the left, the bottom left of the map when you got Valeurs Actuelles on the right. And the third step was to use the Crowdtangle API, which is a tool that allows you to access Facebook data. And we collected from that 10 million posts from about 900 Facebook groups, which included 2.5 million links. So those were the groups of the Yellow Vests during the Yellow Vest movement. And from those, we could study across time on which part of this political map were the links that were shared by the Yellow Vest across time. So that's the graph on the right. And where you can see before the movement that most of the links that were shared by the Yellow Vest were coming from the extreme right, and that progressively through the different acts of the Yellow Vest movement, you could see that the links shared were actually progressively moving to the extreme left, while the extreme right was still present, but there was a strong shift progressively across time. So this is a kind of studies that we could not do anymore. And we cannot do actually anymore because those volumes are not accessible through the data that we could actually collect right now. So I guess that will be it for now, and I will give the floor to Jerome.
Thanks a lot. Yes, I think the question of scale is also something that is central to Jerome.
Thanks. So I'm Jerome Thièvre from INA, the French National Institute. We share the web legal deposit mission in France with BNF, and we have a focus on broadcaster actor in France and some specificities on audiovisual collection. We were very interested with Twitter data because there was a thing called social data, and it was interesting for us to have the reaction from a public, not, as Benjamin said, not everybody's on Twitter, but there's a lot of people. So the reaction from Twitter to TV program, show or event was something important to collect for us. The first API that we used was not Twitter. We started in 2011 with a project more around how to efficiently collect video on YouTube. We are the French National Audiovisual Institute, so it's important for us to be able to collect video and audio media on the web. And so our first step was to see how we can enhance our harvesting capacities on YouTube. As you know, it's not a easy platform to collect. So we choose to develop custom bots to tackle this problem, and we started with YouTube in 2011 and add some other platform across the time. Today we are able to collect medias on 20 platforms, including media sharing platform like YouTube, Dailymotion, but also TV replay, podcast, and some videos that are hosted by pure player, so media born on the web. This first experience with YouTube in 2011 was successful and allow us to do things we can do before. So we start with YouTube RSS, because at the beginning YouTube was providing RSS to follow the videos that was published for each channel, and then we switched to their API. So with this first experience, we chose to we have decided to try to do collect around Twitter in 2014, and with a focus on broadcast TV, radio, show personalities, and also the reaction. So the tweet linked to hashtag, to show or program hashtags, things like that, and the API was the only way to do it. APIs, Twitter APIs and platform API have a lot of limitation, but as Benjamin said, it allows us to be really efficient, to gather massive data. It allows to do things we can do with that API. With TV and radio, it allows us to identify for each YouTube channel, for example, that we want to follow the new videos that are published every day. And so we start in 2014. Sorry, I switched the slide.
You have to wait 5 seconds and then.
Okay. So we were able to collect Twitter for almost 10 years. It has closed last year. Everybody knows that. So we were able to collect 2 billion tweets around TV, radio, but also news. In 2015, there was the attacks, terrorism attacks in Paris. So it was a first focused on an event, focus on an event that we did, and we continue to do this kind of selected collect around important events after that. Like the Yellow Vest movement in France, Me Too, and other big events. What can I say from these 10 years of collect? That APIs, Twitter APIs was a very robust and reliable way to collect data on Twitter. It's one of the tools that we don't have to modify every 2 months because something breaks. It was stable. We have a lot of problem with policy change, and you have to create new account to etc. to access API, and sometimes your account are closed and you don't know why. But it allows to do something very, very durable, I think. Sorry, I just turned my page. The data structure, Benjamin said it, and that also allow us to build innovative interface where you can do specific search on all the fields that you can find, and the metadata you can find in the tweets. You can build aggregation, visualization with the data. So it's very interesting when you want to provide something to your user and to discover what are this type of collection. I also have to mention that. Sorry, I forgot that. So, in the term of the relation between Twitter and TV, we also have an interface that provide a way to have a synchronized stream of TV program. So a TV program synchronized with a stream of tweets that are related to this program. So we don't have all the tweets related to the program, but we have a sample that means something. So I think it's an interesting way to present or to collection in our. We have a lot of the core collection of in our radio and TV programs since 20 years, and the addition of reaction from public was something new and very interesting for researcher. And I also have to mention another initiative from INA. Oh, sorry, not enough. Not yes. Another team in INA, the research team. We have a research department in INA, and they also work on a Twitter collection. It's kind of a joint adventure with Media because we share some collaborators, some ex-INA goes to Media Labs, and I think you used to this kind of collect on some project. So the research team has made a collect from 2018 to last year that collect 15 billion tweets, and the important thing it's a quantitative representative sample of French tweets during this period. So you can do quantitative analysis on this corpus. That's not the case on the web legal deposit collection, because we adjust and add hashtag, add account, and remove them to follow events. So it has not the same properties. So all this data are full text indexed, and you can do a lot of search and discoveries. And INA created last year a lab that allow researchers to come to INA to ask for some data sets or some support or some service around processing tools that INA can offer to research. So in conclusion, for us, API was a great opportunity, and I'm happy to use this as API, and like everybody say, it's a kind of uncertain period now for the future of API. And I think we talk this in the second part of the our exchange, our roundtable.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerome. And now for the researcher's point of view, I lend the floor to Anat.
Thank you. So, so far, I felt that what we've said was kind of a game over atmosphere of things that we could do and we can no longer do. And in my opening statement, I would like to say that this is perhaps the contrary, perhaps an opportunity to rethink what we've been doing so far, and look perhaps at the new opportunities that can be done. Maybe it's not on. Oh, okay. After the age of API access. And I'll do that through 3 provocations that I'll try to explain. The first provocation is that social media, or we need to look at social media as corporations who are taking over the role of memory institutions, but they are not doing it for public interest. And libraries and other memory institutions at the moment are unable to perform their democratic role in preserving digital public records. So the idea here is to frame the debate as a site of struggle between platforms and public interest memory institutions and journalism and researchers, and to look at API access as a site of struggle, reflecting shifting power imbalances between platforms and publics. And this struggle revolves around the ownership, the legitimacy, the temporality and the legality of social media archives, or the contestation of the right to public knowledge in the age of platform power. So in this struggle, platforms' policies, technical architecture, and legal teams have the upper hand. And the resulting social media archives that we have so far, they reflect the negotiations that redefine public records and the right to public knowledge in social media platforms terms and not in public interest terms. As recent work by Muriel McMahon shows, these boundary negotiations between governmental agencies and social media platforms often result in what she calls digital memory holes, and we have many of those at the moment. It is important to note that social media platforms are deliberately playing on this blurring line between private and public data, and this complicates the place of archiving and collective memory. But since most public activity takes place on social media at the moment, and if institutions are allowing platforms to determine the terms and ownership of public record keeping, we are losing history to giant corporations. Us, the public, we have a social contract with memory institutions to preserve our collective memories for us and on behalf of publics, but we didn't sign a similar social contract with platforms to do the same. The second provocation is an attempt to contestate API as our comfortable tool of access. And what I would like to argue here is API is a tool of comfort, but not necessarily an archive, and that we need to question API access as our preferred mode of understanding what a social media archive is or what social media research is. It was mentioned here before, the comfort, the structured data, the scalability that the API data affords. But I think we are conflating the notion of access, data extraction and collection making with archiving and preservation, and I'm not sure that these spreadsheets with records from social media are or can be considered as archives or as what we are looking at when we are studying social media. And this is because, mostly because API data are also a construct of negotiation between corporate interests and public demands. They reveal what platforms would like to share, but they hide other information that platforms would like to hide, perhaps based on commercial interests. So, for example, targeting information, personalization, algorithms, and other personalized data tracing and dynamics, they are completely absent from API data. So we need to remember that. Critics of API-based research have already pointed out the risks of making truth claims using social media data without taking into account that instead of mediating social or political phenomena, these data are originally created to meet specific corporate goals and ideologies. So social media archiving based solely on API access assumes a priori compliance with platform power instead of challenging it. APIs are a tool of comfort if we are to perceive social media as data or as records. But social media are dynamic, algorithmic, and personalized, and none of these aspects are captured through API archiving. The third provocation is also an invitation for all of us, archivists, researchers, journalists, to work collaboratively and creatively to create new social media archives that do not comply with these power imbalances between publics and platforms. And I think there are many creative ways of doing that. They are not as elegant and comfortable as working with structured API data, but I think that with some effort and creativity, we can engage in creative ways of reclaiming the public status of public records that are mediated through these platforms. Thank you.
I have yesterday spoke of bricolage. Speaking of my word, I see that you encourage us to go to some sort of braconnage, but to restore this public status of public records. Maybe after this statement, there are some reaction from. Yeah, I've got some, but I don't want to be the one speaking too much. Benjamin, for instance.
I guess I'll keep some for later. Just one thing is when you say that the data that they provide is only what they want to provide, and what there's always some missing information. I have a good example is we had some colleagues who were working on elements that were removed. Actually, the moderation provided by Facebook, and how they decided or not to remove a post that was alerted and such. And it was a real struggle to actually convince them that we need that data, and actually we never convinced them. We could never get it, so we had to go through weird scraping ways of trying to identify when there's a specific notice that is returned on Twitter when tweets have been deleted. Sometimes the web page ends up being a 404, sometimes it ends up being a page saying this tweet was deleted, sometimes, and all of those are very different, and you have to reverse engineer what they did to try and get this extra information that they want to give. And yeah, even though API are comfortable, indeed, they will never give you everything that you are actually interested in. And so you always have to circumvent a little bit this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Jerome, maybe? You're not obliged. Okay, but the next question will still be for you. Basically, you've used mainly the Twitter API, right?
Yes.
Yes. So it's de facto closed for almost a year now. What are the consequences for you of this closing down? We saw that you've stopped harvesting tweets, but maybe you have looked for other solutions. And if you have found some but did not implement them, maybe you could explain why.
So we have stopped collect around Twitter. Other solution exists, and a researcher used the solution around scraping some or web scraping for web archiving institution. Like for INI, it's hard to go to this way now, because you have to build. When you deal with data, so we took the data away to collect Twitter, and it's hard to change this decision after, because you have to rethink all your preservation, your collect, preservation, and consultation process. If you get some data with other format, or so we don't adapt our collection, we just close it, and with more in the way to think about collecting other platform, maybe Blue Sky, even if it's a little platform in France, but it's really open, and maybe one day it will be something interesting to have the first years of this platform in France. But we stopped around Twitter. We hope maybe with the DSA that it will be a little more open one day, but we don't know.
Yeah, for now, from what I know, Twitter has just set up a Google form.
Yes.
And I don't know anyone who had access after asking access through this Google form. So the willingness might not be here.
I heard about 10 people who tried to access this new research access for Twitter, and I've heard of only one who actually did get this access. For what I heard, the request was written by jurists who copy-pasted the DSA, basically, inside the request. And what the researchers did get access to is the 40,000 dollars payment access, which only provides like hundreds of what we could get with the usual APIs. So even with those kind of access, it's incomparable with the past.
Yeah, the $40,000 API access is ridiculous in comparison to what we had before. Even the 1% streaming API access before 2020. Now, maybe I will stay with you, Benjamin. In the way you are developing software tools for researchers, what did change the APIcalypse, and which other solutions you might turn to?
Well, I got a couple more slides that will help.
Okay.
Yeah. So Frédéric already did a good overview of this, how it changed over the time. But I think it's interesting to see it was a continuous degradation. It was not like suddenly they all closed down, but it's been like 10 years that progressively we see things getting closed back. There was a LinkedIn API initially reclosure a very long time ago, and a few years later LinkedIn even went to suing a company that was scraping its data, which is to me interesting because it's the only jurisprudence I know of a company attacking for scraping. And I think initially they lost, but the Supreme Court in the end gave reason to LinkedIn for some cases. So I'm not really sure about the exact situation. And it's only in the US anyways. I know in France there are some legal situations for scraping, but all of those changes across time have, I mean, since it's going progressively, it has to make you react. And so it's always a game, I mean, of cat and mouse. When Cambridge Analytica, the scandal happened, I like this logo with the Trump's hair on Cambridge Analytica's logo. It led Facebook to not close but limit considerably its API. Like you said, the AlgoPol project was using it and proposing people to actually see their networks of friends on Facebook while they were sharing data with the project and so on. There was also Bernard Rieder at DMI in Amsterdam who built tools called NetViz, who was using the API and allowing people to collect and participate to some more data aggregation projects. All that, and I remember Bernard writing posts on his blog and on Twitter every 2 months saying, the API changed again, I have to change this like this, and it's always a game, and I mean, it's... So, and then the last 2 years were the worst, with Elon Musk buying Twitter, announcing the closure of the API for falsely wrong reasons. I mean, initially he said it was for trashing bots, but at the same time he reopened an API that was only allowing to post tweets. So basically exactly the opposite of what he was saying. So I think everybody understood it as, I'm sharing all of this data for free, now you should pay, which doesn't make any sense for archiving, for research, for so many users. And Twitter also sued last year a center of research who revealed that Twitter was contributing to the propagation of hate online. And so they sued them, but they even requested them to give back the data that they collected in the past, which sounded a little bit crazy. I think they lost Twitter lost the trial a couple of months ago or weeks ago. And right now, I don't think everybody knows that, but Facebook is also retiring CrowdTangle and switching to something else called the Meta Content Library, and which brings me to my next slide. If it loads in a few seconds, yes. So is that there are still things and what I would call residual access. But most of the time, it's a reaction from platform and they do what they want. I think the DSA imposes them some rules, but we are in the situation of minimal compliance. Basically, they will do what they have to make sure they are in the rules of the law, but the law is never precise enough to actually fit the needs. And it was communication always comes first. Frédéric said earlier that the Twitter at some point changed its API access to create the version 2, which was with an academic specific access, which was providing more things. And indeed, it was a real progress because suddenly researchers could access the past. before, with version 1, the Twitter API was only granting you access to the last 8 days. And with the academic version 2, you could go way back in the past. And so they were doing a lot of communication, saying, yeah, it's great, it's a great progress for research and so on. But when you compare the volumes that you could get between the version 1 and version 2, it was, I think there was a ranking, a ratio of 1%. We were limited to 10 million tweets per month. At Media Lab, we use, like Jerome said, and like Ina was saying, we use at some point to collect all tweets in French containing a URL. That's 3 million tweets per day. We collected 100 million tweets per month with that. And if we did try to switch to the API version 2, it was just not possible anymore. So they pushed it as, yeah, it's a progress, but actually it was a drawback. And it's the same, TikTok just created an API, but it's a real progress because there was nothing so far, but they put inside their terms of services a request to review the papers before you publish them. So basically they have a right to read what you want to write on it before, which sounds crazy to any researcher. Meta is creating this new content library to replace Quadtangle, which is a progress because now we have access also to Instagram, and it's an exhaustive database where Quadtangle was only providing access to some groups and some pages. But yeah, but to access this API, you have to be inside a constrained environment from which you cannot export any data. You can only work within the platform. And when you use it, the data is automatically removed every first of the month. So basically, you have to, and the rate limit is so low that you cannot collect massive volumes. So basically, it's a progress, it's exhaustive now, but you cannot access the data. And with Twitter, like we said, right now, there is this new access that they created for DSA, but basically it's not usable. I mean, it's not even granting us access. So what can we do? Like we said, there is the DSA and regulations in general. We can expect maybe Europe, but like you said, we need it on a further step. It only concerns Europe for research in Israel or in the US or anywhere. Doesn't benefit from that. What is interesting to me inside the DSA is that they enshrined scraping. So basically, they say that researchers have the right to scrape platforms, which is, to me, a good step, although we still have no jurisprudence again. And I know so many people who are doing, so many PhDs who are doing scraping and are just like, do I have the right to do that? It's really, it makes people insecure. And like we said before, the problem with the DSA is that it requires platforms to provide some access to research, but there are those limits that it's supposed to concern only systemic risks studies. So, and I guess it's up to the platforms to decide whether what you do concerns systemic risks or not. And like I said before, they will just do standard thing. So what we started doing at Media Lab is also work back with our previous techniques. We have a poster outside with Sarah Aubry about Hive, which is a tool that we built over the past 20 years to create maps of communities of actors on the web, just using the classical backbone of the web, which are HTML web pages and HTTP links between those. We also have the possibility to reuse data donations. Those projects have always existed and are something very interesting when you embark a panel of users, of participative panels of people who agree to share their data with you. And so these are works that still work and are very interesting. And we go back to scraping. We started scraping the whole Doctissimo, which is still a place where there's a lot of interesting things to see about society. Scraping website comments, scraping media articles. I mean, there is still a lot of interesting data. And I wrote a paper a few years ago about Hive that was called Hyperlinks is Not Dead. And because there was this constatation back then that the APIs were taking over because it was so easy that everybody was doing Twitter studies. Everybody was, in just a few minutes, you could collect tweets and do some studies. And that was so easy that a lot of people switched to that. But already then we were saying that there is a risk because we are dependent of those, and continuing to work with classical web and hyperlinks and such is actually useful and interesting, I think.
Thanks a lot, Benjamin. So we had the point of view of one heritage institution, the point of view of the tool building. Beatrice, you've got a quite broad overview of how institutions are trying to archive social media and probably of how they reacted to APIs closing down. So what are the different reactions they had?
Yeah, so I would like to start first by noting that among the institutions that I have interviewed, most of them are not using APIs, are using web crawlers, because for different reasons. It might be related to national legal frameworks not allowing or not being exactly compliant, the APIs not being exactly compliant with national legal frameworks. So it depends. In any case, the impact that the closure of the API has had in preservation strategies has been quite relevant. And through my research, I had the chance to actually capture some of the first reactions to and the first consequences to the closure of the API and the acquisition of Twitter. And as also Benjamin mentioned, this is not unfortunately the first case that this has happened, and the case of Facebook and LinkedIn are quite notable examples. And particularly for the case of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, after the closure of the free access to information after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, that event has largely influenced archiving strategies, so much so that many archiving institutions had to either pause archiving activities on that platform or actually removing it completely. And I think this is quite problematic, because if we think especially that Facebook is one of the is the social media with the highest number of active users in almost all countries that are involved to any degrees in the preservation of social media. This has also happened for Twitter, unfortunately. And when I followed up around, that was February 2023, with some of the institutions I had interviewed only a few months before, when everything was fine, basically. They all expressed, of course, their concerns regarding the new changes. And there are many examples, like Jerôme has, for example, has illustrated. There's also another example could be there was this interesting initiative, crowdsourcing initiative launched by the Science Data Center for Literature in collaboration with the National German Library. They started basically to, they wanted to create a comprehensive archive of German language tweets with the library facilitating basically the storage of this resource. And this was an initiative that was launched in response to that uncertainty that surrounded the platform's fate after the acquisition. And I thought that was quite interesting, but they had to stop archiving basically 3 months after they started, because the Twitter academic API, which was the one that the people contributing to the initiative were using, was terminated. Of course, another, I think, important element that needs to be considered is that the introduction of the new paid tier access system, which of course imposes additional financial burdens to many social media archiving institutions. And several of the institutions that I followed up with, this was, as I said, the early stages of the takeover. They were waiting to see what the tiers would look like, and especially the terms of service and what kind of access they would be provided with. But certainly, many institutions have already stretched budgets, and but probably not many of them will be able to sustain this kind of financial burden, as I said, in the long term, especially. And also, smaller institutions, smaller independent institutions would probably be disproportionately affected by the paywall, because most of them have even lower budget, if none. And also, I would like to point out another thing is that the restrictions that social media companies impose on harvesting often extend beyond API access. And this has been observed also with Facebook and LinkedIn, where the increased constraints on access through the official API were followed shortly after with also additional constraints for web crawlers. And in fact, in the new terms, XX terms of service, which is effective from the end of September last year, there is a note now under the misuse of service section, which now explicitly prohibits crawling and scraping without X's prior written consent, whereas before Twitter acquisition, before the changes, there was a similar note, but the note said that the crawling was permitted if done in accordance with the provisions, including the robot.txt file. So to a certain extent, web crawling was permitted, and this has allowed many institutions to archive content from that. So yeah, the changes implemented on Twitter have dealt a significant blow to social media archiving initiatives using APIs. And I think this poses many concerns, especially because Twitter is the most archived social media platform, and at least until the early 2023. So it'd be interesting to see what's going to happen, basically.
In the methodological sections of my articles, when I explain why I'm using Twitter data, I answer very easily. It's because it's easy.
Yeah.
Which is not, because I'm trying to be honest, but it's not scientifically, academically, how to say that, very rigorous. I will change a bit the question that will serve as a conclusion that I wanted to ask Anat. How do we get out of our comfort zone then? Can you develop your third provocation?
Yeah. So what I've been trying to do in the past years is to build counter archives of social media. And these archives, let's say, a priori give up the notion of completeness or the idea that we can capture everything. And instead, what I'm trying to do is to kind of reverse the mirror to social media and to build archives that show what social media platforms prohibit us from knowing as publics. What kind of other types of knowledge we can gain if we restructure the data differently, if we put search engines on top of data collected from social media and do comparative analysis in ways that personalized algorithms prohibit us from experiencing as users, and so on and so forth. So my way of approaching this is based on the politics or agonistic politics, in a way that shows the plurality of ways of exposing this conflict between researchers, publics, and social media platforms, and making that conflict more tangible. I certainly value the value of all data sets. We are always pursuing the new. We think that we need to do social media research only on the most recent data. But over the past decade, we have collected so much data that is just scattered around so many labs and computers and archives, and we are not sharing that knowledge with one another. And one of the things I'm envisioning and maybe trying to build in the future is some kind of infrastructure that would allow researchers and journalists and archives and institutions to share previously collected social media data for the benefit of the commons, in a way. And lastly, I know the DSA doesn't apply to me institutionally, so I always have to think outside of the box. So if I don't have a possibility of requesting data through the DSA, then I'm always looking for other ways to tweak and circumvent the platform's limitations. So recently, we've been able to collect a lot of tweets through automating the browser search function of Twitter using queries in the search box and then getting the latest tweets and automating this process through the browsers. So it's not really web scraping, but it's a circumvention that allows us to continue scrutinizing the platforms. Because I think this is one of the main issues with API deprecations, is that we can no longer scrutinize the platforms. It's not just the data that we can study, but what platforms are doing or trying to not let us in to see. So we continue doing that in various creative and not very elegant ways. But I think that that effort is worth it to make that also the political claim or reclaiming of the public status of that data.
Thanks a lot. I think we'll switch to a question session from the audience. Who has questions? And the question can come from the panelists too.
Thank you so much for this great roundtable and for all those converging and sometimes diverging a little bit points of views. I was wondering to what extent, just to bounce back on what you just said, to what extent the IIPC could act as a network for you to have colleagues in countries that are under the jurisdiction of the DSA and that are able to, for example, through memorandums of understanding, do such requests for the data that you might need, and then collaborate for your research purpose, but also maybe for archiving purpose, to co-build in the same way that multinationals play the rules of the national and international jurisdictions. To what extent the IIPC can also do the request in the legal environments that are most favorable to its members and act as a kind of forum to do that. So that's my first question. The second question is, to what extent do you think that this APIcalypse will revert to a more open model as we realize that LLMs have been trained? They're mostly open source now. The open source ones are very strong and dynamic. And so the marginal value of trying to obtain human written data on social media will become very low. And so at some point, it will not make sense to block access to API, and API will be open again. That there was this kind of understanding that it was very useful that this data suddenly had a lot of value thanks to transformers and the ability to have large language models. But now that the hype is gone and that the models are working fine and it's becoming more and more mainstream, to what extent this calculus or this representation of the value of data by those actors will change again and go back to something that we can use? And in that case, do you think you have the infrastructure to catch back on that period of time during which the API was closed?
Any questions?
I can try to answer. I can't speak for the IIPC board or steering committees, but I'm not sure IIPC is able to do some lobbying to do some lobbying with DSA regulators, but it would be great to advocate for the right to archive. We have some research partnership or little project where the archiving of Twitter was complementary to the colleagues that the researcher can do by themselves, because at the time they were studying Me Too and sexual violence expression on Twitter, but it was in 2021, so a lot of tweets and a lot of Twitter has disappeared between that period, and they can find some of these tweets in archive. So it would be And I read, when I read the DSA article, I was surprised that archiving or archival or preservation or something was not mentioned anywhere. So I think it would be great if IIPC could advocate for web archiving, and with API or not, but with API it would be great. So that's I can say for the first question. For your second question, I don't know if Benjamin could say something, but
I would more react, like you said, on the catching up the data. I guess is, even though Twitter was suddenly going back and providing a new access, like unlimited access, what Beatrice, one of the results from Beatrice Mazoyer's PhD when she was at INA was actually to realize that there is an accretion of about 10% of tweets over 1 month. So basically, that means that after 1 month, about 10% of the tweets that were posted have already disappeared, either because they were removed by the user, or because they were censored by Twitter, or because the accounts was closed. And so basically, no, this period is, you can get some data from this period, but you won't get data with the same qualities than you were getting before, and you won't be able to have corpuses that would be comparable. So I would say catching up, no, Twitter already did it what they wanted, and it has its consequences, and we have to deal with that. But I like what Anat was saying, and I think there's actually other initiatives that I know of. I don't know about the IIPC organization of this, but I know that there are a bunch of people across the world who are thinking about basically saying to Twitter, well, you want to mess with us, well, we don't care about your terms of services anymore then. And I guess the trial that was won by the Center for Research on Hate is a good step towards this direction. Basically, Twitter forbade us back in the past to republish tweets that we collected. I guess maybe we could think about ways to aggregate all databases that were collected. I know there was, it was built in the US, but it's a worldwide thing. More on the research part, there is a coalition for transparent tech that exists. And people from this coalition are building a platform where people should be able to publish corpuses. And I don't know if they think already of aggregating everything together, because of course everybody has data in their own format. And so it's always a mess to try and aggregate and deduplicate. And so it poses a lot of technical questions. But yeah, I guess we could try and organize to try and recreate at least data for the past. And like you said, I mean, just at Media Lab, I think we have 1.5 billion tweets for 1 year and a half. It would be, I mean, of course, we're still using it every day, and it's a database that we will keep using for at least the next 5 years, I guess. And there is a lot of work to still do. It's just that we have, I think, to just accept that these studies were on this period, and we will do different studies and different methods in the future.
Beatrice, do you want it maybe?
I think there's a question.
Yeah, but I have a complementary comment to do. But I think you're over optimistic with the large language models, because if you look at those who are open source, most of them are open source on a limited way, in the sense that usually the training data set is not open source. Yeah. There are some exceptions, but for instance, Llama from Facebook, you can download the model, and it's not exactly open source, but it tends to be. But the training model, you won't access it. You have an idea of what's in it. It's the same for Mistral, that you can also download on your computer. You have both of them on my computer, and run them privately. But Mistral is really lobbying the French and tries to orient the French states position at Brussels to be sure that the training dataset will remain closed. So that's, but we can discuss that, of course. Second question.
Yeah, more remark about the discussion of the sharing corpus and what is already collected. There's not just the DSA, and there are other laws that are relevant for this, and maybe make this not so easy. Copyright, especially in Europe, you can't just share collected data, and privacy laws. I'm from the German National Library, and this was already mentioned that we collected last year via donation tweets, but we can't share this. We can only give access in our reading rooms to the data to researchers. We can't just hand out the collected data to researchers outside the library. That's just not within our legal deposit. So there are some barriers to do this sharing of existing corpora.
I guess for privacy issues, there's definitely a lot of question regarding resharing such data sets, but we could try and pseudonymize some of those data sets, I guess, although it will still be re-identifiable since you can always search for the text of a tweet and find the user who posted it. But my understanding of GDPR is that that wouldn't be too critical in such case, but the main question would be more for copyright. And there, I don't know. I don't know what's exactly the status of content right on a text posted by user on platforms. I think people gave their right to Twitter, and Twitter shares it with us with the API. But I'm no jurist, and I'm not sure exactly of what would be exactly the right.
Yeah. It may take some effort, but I think it's possible. So you could build some access framework to this collaborative archive of data sets and allow researchers access, not anyone to access the data only for research purposes, and keep the data secured in one place. So the idea is not to give up on the entire idea of the possibility of this, but to try to make the effort to see how far we can get in trying to create such infrastructure, given the justified limits of that. So counter archives, in my view, should be ethical and legal, not just an anarchist way of irresponsibly sharing data that could harm someone else's rights. So I think that perhaps with the anonymization and other measures or opt-out measures, we could work towards building such infrastructure.
And in the case of research, we might have the chance, at least in the European Union, and because of the GDPR, and thanks to the GDPR, we might have a better margin of maneuver than heritage institution, because when you speak to a digital privacy officer, data privacy officer, sorry, they always say first that it's not possible. Whatever the questions, it's no. And then you speak to them, I mean, not in a meeting, but face to face, and then they always find the exception with boundaries, of course. It's never an exception that allows you to do whatever you want. And it's good because as citizens, we want our privacy to be respected. But at least on the research side, there might be a different perspective. But here again, I'm not a lawyer.
But yeah, of course, I mean, I don't think anyone here advocates for a full access to such republished database. It would be for a specific consultation by researchers, or, of course.
maybe two questions. One, because I may have missed the information. What is the status and the relationship between X and the Library of Congress today? Do they still have, I know they wanted to be exhaustive, then they went to representativeness, but know what are they doing, and does someone know what is the current relationship? Second point about TikTok reviewing papers by scientists. It reminded me of companies in history when we are doing business history, or a lot of companies also ask to see what we have made of their sources. Of course, it's not user-generated contents, but it's something that has also a long-term history. I just wanted to know if you knew a few examples and what they are looking for when they are reviewing this paper. Is it about content, the image of the company, or so? Do you have a few examples about it?
For the second question on my side, no. I have no example.
Yeah, I don't have either any example. My understanding is that it's indeed for the image of the company that they want to review, especially TikTok. Basically, TikTok started doing some action towards researchers when they started having public relations problems. There were studies in the US. They were proactive. They did that before the DSA imposed them anything, and it was like I think a bit more than a year ago. And there were studies from the US, I think, revealing that TikTok was pushing more hate videos before other. I mean, the algorithm were pushing for things that were not really nice. And following that, they realized that that researchers were scraping their data to build this kind of study. And so that's when they started to develop their program to provide data to researchers. So my understanding, and maybe that's a bit polemic, but coming from a company that is clearly intertwined with the Chinese government, I guess, that makes quite some sense. I don't have more explanation for that. Sorry, what was the first question again?
X and Library of Congress.
Yeah, the lock and X today.
I don't have the details myself, but my understanding was that the Library of Congress stopped archiving Twitter like a few years ago already, before even Elon Musk arrived. I don't have, yeah.
Yeah, I know. That's a project that was stopped years before, and they were still archiving a few social media, but then they were removed, I think, before 2020, and then they basically decided to start a new project where they were testing different options to archive successfully, or at least consistently, social media.
Maybe a last question? Yeah. Last question or not? Maybe not the last question.
Thank you very much. I want to touch on something that you have mentioned in passing. That's that in the GDPR, there's the possibility of data portability for individuals and data donations. Is that something that you're also thinking that you will have to work with in an age of not data abundance anymore, but sort of data scarcity? That you're either relying on institutions to get individual donations from exports from their Facebook's account, X account, and stuff like this. Is that something that you're already doing or that you see as being done? What is your thoughts on this method?
If I go back to the AlgoPol project, so the AlgoPol project had to stop collecting Facebook posts in 2016, but they collected enough posts, in fact, to carry on their work. But basically, it was based on donation through the Facebook API, but they were asking, and that was part of the project. That was also a sort of pedagogy of big data in a way, of data privacy. People could go to a website, accept that the AlgoPol project tools access their profile, and then they could also themselves see a visualization of their graph, of their Facebook graph, etc., to understand what kind of data they were giving to Facebook. That was part of the project too. And so that was through the API kinds of donation of data. Now it would be going to the Facebook menu, and then another item, and then another item, and then another item, because it was very hidden, to ask a dump of your data and then send it to researchers. I suppose that we will have to do it if we want to carry on research about that. But the big platforms can be very good at complicating and complexifying our work, like the dump would be in PDF or something like that.
Yeah, usually there are zips with a lot of files that you have
Yes.
to crawl through. But yeah, the AlgoPoll is a good example, definitely, of such a project. And there was this incentive of pushing users by proposing to them to get like a network graph of their connections on Facebook. And so there was a little bit of a gamification of the thing. And so people were voluntarily contributing to the project and sharing the data. But indeed, it was still going through the API. We had a long time ago another example at Media Lab where people with old phones, 2Gs phones, where people were having a qualitative interview with a researcher, and at the end of the interview were proposed to share the data from their phone, because it was they were studying the habits and uses of people with their phones, and so their rhythm of exchanges through texts and phone calls by then, and so people were voluntarily giving their phone and connecting it using a Russian malware that was going through and collecting everything. So that's another example. And but I know that there are some projects that are sort of right now to also propose people to voluntarily. We are thinking about that with Twitch, so that a panel of users would install Chrome or Facebook or Firefox extension inside the browser, and the browser would collect the data live, so it wouldn't use any API, but the users that were participants would have an extra tool that would a little bit spy on their use of Twitch and report that by sending it to a server. This is just a project. We haven't implemented it at all yet.
Okay, we don't have the time for a last question. So thanks a lot to our two colleagues who carried the microphones. Thanks a lot to the Régie also. Thanks a lot to the BNF and to the IIPC, and thanks a lot to the audience, and of course to our panelists.